It was the year 1959. Carl Gustav Jung was 84 years old and knew that he had little time left. He was sitting in his house in Küsnacht by the shore of Lake Zurich and looking at the water. The same view accompanied him for most of his life. The same silence. The same rhythm of the waves. But something has changed. Not in the landscape, in him. For over 50 years, Jung studied the human psyche. He delved into dreams, examined symbols, and spoke with hundreds of patients. Broken people, lost, searching for something they could not name. He was a psychiatrist, a thinker, a scientist, a man who had answers, or at least that was how the world perceived him. But in recent years, Jung was doing something that few people knew about. He was writing. Not for publishers, not for the academy, not for history. He wrote privately, notes that were meant to remain only for him. And in these notes, with the utmost sincerity of a man who has nothing left to prove, he wrote something that would surprise anyone who only knew him from books. He wrote that he had asked the wrong questions his whole life. Stop for a moment on this thought. A man who revolutionized the understanding of the human psyche. A man who introduced concepts such as introvert and extrovert, complex, archetype into the language, the collective unconscious. A man whose ideas outlived him by decades and still shape psychology, philosophy, culture. In the twilight of life, he sat by the lake and thought that he had asked about the wrong things. This is not a story of failure. This is a story of something much rarer, of true change, about what happens to a person when they stop being afraid and start saying what they really see. Jung was never a man who easily made mistakes, or rather, he was not a man who easily admitted that he was wrong. He was born in 1875 in a small Swiss village, the son of a Protestant pastor. The house in which he grew up was full of God, but Jung felt very early on that the God his father spoke of, and the God he himself, still a boy, felt in the silence of the forest behind the house. These are not the same beings, that something is wrong with the story they are telling him, that there is some gap, some crack between the words and the experience. Throughout his childhood he went to church and listened, and the more he listened, the more he felt that gap. The words were certain. Experience, his own internal, was completely something else, chaotic, incomprehensible, alive. That's why he chose psychiatry. At that time, psychiatry was not a prestigious field. It was a dirty job. The mentally ill were locked away, isolated, treated as a problem to be hidden. Jung entered this world consciously. He wanted to understand what no one understood. He wanted to go down to where others were afraid. And he went down. His first real work with patients at the Bergolsli Clinic in Zurich at the beginning of the 20th century was an experience that shaped everything that was to come later. Jung sat for hours with people whom other psychiatrists dismissed after 15 minutes. He listened to their dreams. He listened to their delusions. To stick a label and write a prescription, he asked what it means, what this person is trying to tell me, what her unconscious is trying to tell her. Then he met Freud, and for several years that was the most important intellectual relationship of his life. Freud was like a father, brilliant, dominant, absolutely convinced of his own correctness. Jung was like a son who admires, learns, but at a certain moment looks at his father and thinks, no, this is not the whole truth. The break with Freud in 1912 was a trauma for Jung, which he did not speak of directly, but which left its mark on everything. For several years after this separation, Jung experienced something he described as a confrontation with his own unconsciousness. Visions. Dreams so intense that he woke up screaming. Images he could not understand. He was a psychiatrist and wondered if he was losing his mind. He was not losing it, but he had to go through this to understand what cannot be understood in any other way than through personal experience. And this is where the part of the story begins that is talked about the least. In the midst of his own crisis, Jung began working with patients who were dying. He did not plan for this. That's just how life turned out. Some of his patients received terminal diagnoses, cancer, heart diseases, ailments for which medicine of those times had no answers, and Jung, instead of stepping back, instead of handing these people over to someone else, decided to stay, listen, observe. What happens to a person when they know they are dying? This question could sound like a medical question, but Jung was not interested in the medical aspect. He was interested in something else. What happens to the psyche? What happens to what a person thinks about themselves, with all the roles, masks, stories that they have built around their own name throughout their life? What he saw made him reconsider everything. People who approached death changed. Not everyone, not immediately. But there was a certain pattern that repeated itself often enough for Jung to start documenting it with increasing attention. It started with dreams. Patients who previously had ordinary, chaotic dreams about work, about arguments, about everyday matters, suddenly they began to dream differently. Images of the road appeared. A long, endless road stretching somewhere into the distance. Rivers that had to be crossed. Bridges suspended over the abyss, mountains whose peaks are not visible, landscapes that the patients have never seen while awake, and those which Jung considered particularly intriguing, described almost identically, regardless of where they came from, what they believed, or what kind of life they had lived. Jung recorded all of this. In these notes, which for years were available only to a few, one can see how something more than psychiatric curiosity gradually grows within him. One can see someone who is beginning to be moved. Someone who asks themselves a question for which there is no ready answer. But let's go back for a moment to the year 1959. To Jung, sitting by the lake. At that time he was already famous all over the world. His books were translated into dozens of languages. Students came to Zurich from all over Europe and America to attend his lectures. Journalists requested interviews. Philosophers referred to his work. He was an icon. He sat by the lake and thought about his patients, those who had long since passed away, those whose dreams he remembered better than his own, those who, in the last weeks of their lives, told him things that no one from the world of the academy had ever told them. One of his patients, a woman in her 70s with a diagnosis of inoperable cancer, once told him something that Jung quoted in his own notes. She said, "Doctor, I am no longer afraid, but not because I am ready to die. Because something in me remembers that I have experienced it before." Jung asked her what she meant. She said that feeling is like coming home. To a home I have never been to before, but whom I know. Jung did not answer immediately. They sat in silence for a moment. And then, when he left her room, he wrote one sentence in his notebook. The psyche seems to know something that the conscious mind has not yet accepted. This sentence, written privately not for any publication, is, according to many researchers of Jung's work, one of the most sincere sentences he ever wrote. For Jung balanced his whole life between science and experience, between what can be measured and what can only be felt, between the psychiatrist he was by education and profession, and the man who throughout his life saw things that could not be found in any textbook. In old age, he stopped hiding that tension. He began to speak about it directly, not in lectures, not in official publications, but in conversations with loved ones, in letters, in notes he wrote late at night, when the house was quiet and the lake outside the window had that special silver color that appears only at dawn. In one of those letters, written less than a year before his death, to a friend whose name historians still debate, Jung wrote something that could be revealed to be considered a summary of his entire life. He wrote, "I think that for most of his life he was searching for something that was already within him, and that this irony may be the greatest wisdom that a person can reach. It is not the sentence of a defeated man. It is the sentence of a man who has come to peace, who has gone through everything, through glory and doubts, through genius and mistakes, through decades of delving into the darkest corners of the human psyche. And he came out of it with something that cannot be bought or obtained, with silence. That's why what Jung said at the end of his life about God, about death, about who we really are, is not another theory. It is not another system that can be accepted or rejected. It is a witness's testimony. A person who has seen more than most, who sat by the beds of the dying for decades, who delved into human dreams, human pain, human loneliness, and human hope, and who in the end said, "Here is what I found, not what I wanted to find, not what was convenient. What is?" And that is what made his last words different from anything he had written before, because it was not a theory. It was an experience. There was a certain moment in Jung's work that changed everything. It was not a spectacular moment. There was no revelation in it, no sudden breakthrough that could be described in one sentence. It was something that had been building slowly over the years. Thank you for watching. Jung worked with dying people for decades, not because he specialized in palliative medicine, not because someone asked him to, but because they were his patients, people who came to him with various problems, and then it turned out that they had cancer, heart disease, a condition for which there is no cure. And Jung, instead of ending the therapeutic relationship, stayed, continued. He kept listening. He understood something that many of his colleagues did not understand, that the moment of dying is perhaps the most important psychological moment in a person's entire life, and that if one truly wants to understand the psyche, one cannot look away just when she reveals herself most fully. What he began to observe was subtle at first. Change of tone in conversations, change of topics. Patients who for months talked about pain, about fears, about grief, about unresolved issues from the past, suddenly they started talking about something else. Not everyone, not at the same pace, but often enough for Jung to begin noting it down with increasing regularity. The first thing he noticed was the change in dreams. There was a man among his patients, an engineer, practical, rational, a man who measured the world with numbers and diagrams his whole life. When he found out that he had a few months to live, he dreamt chaotically for the first few weeks. He would wake up at night. The dreams were full of fear, pursuit, a feeling that something was chasing him, that he wouldn't make it, that he wouldn't finish something. Jung recognized this pattern. It was the ego in panic. It was a part of the psyche that understands it is losing control and reacts in the only way it knows, a desperate attempt to keep things in order. But after a few weeks, something changed. The man came to the session and said that he dreamed of a river. In the unfrightening river, harmless. Just a wide, calm river that flowed through a meadow he had never seen before. He stood at the edge and knew he had to cross it. But, and this was surprising to him, he did not feel fear. He felt something he described as a kind of longing, as if on the other side there was something he had longed for without knowing it. Jung wrote it down and did not tell the patient right away what he thought about it. He waited, observed. In the following weeks, the dreams of this man consistently returned to images of the road, a long road leading somewhere into the depths of an unknown landscape, a bridge over an abyss that looked menacing. But when he stepped on it, in a dream, it turned out to be solid. Mountains whose peaks are not visible, but whose ascent was not exhausting, only calm, step by step, as if time had stopped counting. Jung had seen this pattern before, and saw it later in other patients, women and men, older and relatively young, believing in what is happening. Regardless of who they were and what they believed, as they approached death, their dreams began to speak the same language, the language of the road, river, bridge, crossing. Jung was a psychiatrist and a scientist, so the first question he asked himself was why? What makes the human psyche reach for these specific images in the face of death? Is it culture? Are these symbols that we all unconsciously absorb through myths, religions, stories? Is it just a metaphor that the brain constructs to give meaning to something for which there are no words? But the longer he observed, the less satisfying these explanations were, because the symbols were too consistent, too precise. And they appeared in people who, Jung checked this thoroughly, had no contact with each other, did not read the same books, did not profess the same religion. Something in the human psyche, regardless of its external form, seemed to have access to the same deep reservoir of images. It was the moment when Jung began to develop the concept he called the collective unconscious, the non-individual unconscious, that which was pushed beneath the surface by one specific person during their lifetime, but with something deeper, something common to the whole species. As if beneath the personal psyche of each of us there existed another layer, older and more extensive, full of images and patterns, that appear everywhere there, where a person approaches the boundary of their own understanding. But that was only the first stage of what he was observing. The second stage came later. When the disease progressed and the body began to clearly weaken, figures started to appear in the patient's dreams. Not always human, sometimes animals, dogs, eagles, deer, which came peacefully, without aggression, and seemed to accompany rather than threaten. Sometimes old men or old women with calm faces, who said nothing, only were present. Sometimes figures without distinct features, but with a sense of warmth and safety, which patients, upon waking, described as something they could not name in any human language. Jung recognized in these figures what he called archetypes, figures rooted deep in the collective psyche of humanity. The guide, wise old man, great mother, they were not symbols invented by individual patients. They were structures that the psyche activates at specific moments, as if it had a built-in compass indicating what is needed at a given stage of the journey. One of his patients, a woman who had been a tough, self-sufficient person throughout her adult life, needing help from no one. She told him a dream in which she was walking through a dark forest, and suddenly she saw an old woman sitting by the fire in front of her. The old woman looked at her, and she only said one sentence: "You can stop now." The patient woke up crying, but as she emphasized every time Jung asked her to describe that dream, they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, as if something she had worn for decades was suddenly taken off her shoulders. Jung recorded it, and he recorded dozens of similar stories. And he slowly began to understand that what he observes is not an ordinary defense mechanism of a dying brain. This is something that looks like a process, intentional, sequential, consistent, as if the psyche had its own knowledge of what the body is going through, as if she didn't need a doctor to tell her that time is running out, as if she knew it herself and was preparing in her own way. The third stage was the one that impressed Jung the most, perhaps because it was the most difficult to explain in the terms used by psychiatry of that time, when the illness became very advanced, when patients had already spent most of their time in bed, when contact with the outside world began to diminish, they became luminescent. This is the only word that Jung consistently used. Luminescent, luminous, as if saturated with some inner glow that had no source in any specific place of the dream, but permeated everything. Patients described fields that glowed from within, cities built of light, the sky and colors that, as they said, do not exist in real life, and yet they were more real than anything they had ever seen while awake. Figures from the dreams of the second stage returned, but now they were different, as if more real, as if the barrier between the dreamer and the dreamed had melted away. What Jung noted with exceptional care is the emotional reaction upon awakening. There was no fear in her. There was astonishment. There were often tears. But the patients, when asked what they felt, invariably said variations of the same thing. It was beautiful. I didn't know that something could be so beautiful. One of his patients, a man who had claimed all his life to be a tough realist, and he does not believe in anything that cannot be measured. He woke up one morning and said to Jung, "I dreamed of something for which I have no words. And for the first time in my life, I think that the lack of words is not a problem, that maybe it is just as it should be." Jung sat next to him for an hour. He did not analyze, did not interpret, only listened. He already understood then, although he could not yet fully articulate it, that he was facing something for which psychiatry as a science does not yet have the proper language, that what it observes does not fit into any existing category, that it is either a deep biological illusion that the dying brain creates to numb itself before the end, or something completely different. The head of those times did not want to speak loudly. The fourth stage came just before the end and was the hardest to describe, because the patients who went through it had less and less strength to report their dreams in detail. But what Jung managed to gather from fragmentary descriptions, from gestures, from facial expressions, from single sentences spoken half-consciously, it formed a coherent picture. The sense of separateness disappeared. Not in the sense of disorientation, not in the sense of confusion of the senses, but in the sense of some deep, calm recognition that the boundary between the self and everything else is a construct. That what a person has called themselves throughout their life, their name, their history, their fears and hopes, their merits and grievances, it was not his true center, it was a layer, a useful layer, essential for life in the world, but not the essence. Under that layer, as it slowly disintegrated, there was something that the patients could not name, but whose presence they described as tranquility. No resignation, not giving up, calm, as if after a very long journey they had arrived at a place they paradoxically knew. Jung wrote in his notes a sentence that he repeated in various forms for many years. The psyche does not behave like something that is heading towards an end. It behaves like something that is heading towards a return. He did not proclaim this from the pulpit. He did not publish it as a dogma. He was too good a scientist to claim that he knows something that cannot be proven, but he was also too honest an observer to pretend that he does not see what he sees. I feel the tension between what science could say and what the psyche seemed to know. It accompanied him until the end of his life. He sat with him by the lake in Kusnacht, wrote with him in his private notes, and finally, when he had nothing left to prove and no one to convince, he said it outright. But to understand what he said, one must first understand, when he discovered that what he observed in the dying, he also observes elsewhere, in people who are not dying, in people who are just beginning to live. It was a moment that changed everything. There was a certain patient whom Jung never described by name in any of his published works. He only appears in private notes, marked by initials and a few sentences of context. A young man just under 30 years old, physically healthy, with no diagnosis that could explain what he has been going through. He ended up with Jung because of what he himself called a feeling that he was living beside his own life. He was not in depression in the clinical sense of the word. He functioned, worked, maintained relationships, but had the impression that everything he did was happening. It was not hypnosis, it was not suggestion. It was a method based on consciously entering the images emerging from the unconscious, entering into a dialogue with the characters that appear there and allowing the process to unfold at its own pace, without imposing direction on it by the conscious mind. After a few weeks of work, this man began to describe something that made Jung stand still with a pen in hand. He described the images of the road, the river that must be crossed, a landscape he had never seen while awake, but which he felt was familiar. He described figures that appeared in his inner visions, calm, accompanying, requiring nothing. He described moments when the feeling of being behind the glass suddenly disappeared, and something remained that he could not name, but which he felt was absolutely true. More real than anything he has experienced while awake. Jung was sitting across from him and thought one thing. How does he know that? Because those were the same images, the same language, the same sequential pattern that Jung for years documented people dying. A man who had his whole life ahead of him, he was going through something that Jung had, until then, associated solely with the end of life. And it didn't happen by chance. It didn't happen under the influence of fear of death, not under the influence of any suggestion. It happened because the man allowed his unconsciousness to speak. He simply listened. Jung did not talk about it to anyone for several days. He sat with that observation alone and tried to refute it. He was looking for alternative explanations. It may be a coincidence. Maybe the patient unconsciously absorbed some cultural symbols that he was now reproducing. It may simply be a coincidence, one case that means nothing. But then he started looking back at his notes from the last few years, and he began to notice a pattern that had been there all along, only no one, including himself, had asked the right question. Among his patients who worked deeply with their unconscious, who took analysis seriously and entered into it without resistance, reports of similar experiences regularly emerged. Not always so clear, not always so complete, but the same language of images, the same sequence. It is the gradual loosening of something that Jung called the grip of the ego, this incessant need to control, define, categorize one's own identity. And then he understood something that changed the entire architecture of his thinking. What he observed in the dying was not a product of dying. Dying was only a condition that forced what could be achieved differently under other circumstances. Death took away the man's ability to escape. It took away his ability to engage in something else, to distract himself, to fill his time with work, plans, and responsibilities. It put him in a place from which there is no escape, and at this point the psyche, deprived of an escape route, did what it had always wanted to do. She was descending deeper, returning to something primal, but if it was not death that was the necessary condition, only the lack of escape, it meant that the same process could be triggered without dying. It can be invoked by a conscious descent into the depths. Through working with the unconscious, through meditation that is not relaxation, but a true stopping of the mind, through sleep that is analyzed instead of rejected, through the readiness to meet within ourselves what we fear, Jung began to systematically test this hypothesis. He began to ask patients who were undergoing a deep analytical process about specific experiences. He started to compare their reports with notes from working with the dying. The more I compared, the more apparent the convergence became. Not identity, because every person is different and every process has its own character. But the structural consistency was undeniable. The same guides, the same images of transition, the same gradual disintegration of the sense of being a separate, distinct self. And in the end, for those who went deep enough, the same thing that Jung could not describe better than in one word: wholeness. He also began to reach wider. He started to systematically read accounts from traditions that for centuries dealt with what we would today call working with the unconscious, although they used a different language. Christian mystics described the dark night of the soul as a stage preceding union. Buddhist texts on the dissolution of the illusion of a separate self. Sufic poets writing about the death of the ego as a condition for meeting with what is true. Shamanic traditions in which initiation involved symbolic death and rebirth. Jung was never a man who easily succumbed to enthusiasm. He was too shaped by science, too cautious about what was unverifiable, but standing before a convergence that had repeated in dozens of cultures for thousands of years, and which was now repeating in his office in Zurich with specific people, he could not ignore it. He began to understand that these traditions did not describe different things, described the same thing in different words, that the mystic and the dying patient and the person in deep analysis and the shaman undergoing initiation all touch the same territory, the territory that exists in the human psyche regardless of culture, regardless of era, regardless of beliefs, the territory that awaits beyond the ego. And here Jung used the term for the first time, which became one of the most important in all of his work. He said that a person does not have to die to experience what awaits after death. It is enough for the ego to die during his lifetime. It is enough for that part of the psyche that constantly manages the image of oneself to control the narrative. Identity weapon? Though it will let go for a moment. Though it will stop for a moment. It sounds simple. But Jung knew better than anyone that it is not simple. The ego does not let go voluntarily. The ego is designed for survival and considers its own survival synonymous with the survival of the person. When it begins to lose control, it reacts like any mechanism threatened with dismantling, resistance, fear, rationalization. It's dangerous to say that. It's madness. It's a waste of time. Go back to what you know. Return to what is safe, and most people listen. This is, according to Jung, the tragedy of an average life. There is no lack of success. I do not lack love or fulfillment in the common sense, but rather that a person lives their whole life on the surface of themselves. That the ego is such a good administrator, such an efficient manager of everyday life, that there is never a reason to go lower. That the true depth of the psyche remains unvisited. That a person dies, not knowing who they were. Jung was around 50 years old at that time. He was in the middle of his own life, far from the end, though of course he did not know that. And this observation, this discovery, that awakening is not reserved for the dying, that it is available here and now for anyone who dares to descend, this discovery did not fill him with triumph. It filled him with unease, for he simultaneously understood the other side of this discovery, that since it is possible, since the road exists, to each person who does not take it on, does so by choice, often an unconscious one, often dictated by fear, which it does not even recognize as fear, but rather by choice, and that meant that most of the people Jung encountered in everyday life, on the street, in the cafe, at the academy, lived in a kind of voluntary dream. Convinced that she is awake, because she moves across the surface with skill and confidence. There was no sense of superiority in him. Jung knew his own ego too well to allow himself superiority, but there was a certain kind of pain in it. He saw how much suffering comes precisely from this superficiality. How much fear, how much emptiness, how much sense of meaninglessness is a product of life, in which a person has never truly met themselves. In one of the lectures from that period, lectures that were relatively unknown compared to his main publications, Jung said a sentence that his students remembered for a lifetime. He said, "Neurosis is always a substitute for justified suffering." He meant that when a person avoids meeting the deeper truth about themselves, the truth does not disappear, turns into a symptom, into anxiety, into depression, in the feeling of emptiness, which has no clear cause, because the cause is too deep to be localized without going deeper. But there was also a second conclusion that followed from this, and Jung formulated it directly. Almost neurosis is a substitute for justified suffering. Justified suffering means a conscious descent into depth, a confrontation with what we fear, a meeting with the shadow, with the rejected parts of ourselves is the path to freedom. Not an easy one. An inexpensive pleasure, but the only one that really leads to where a person, if they are honest, really wants to reach. And now Jung understood that this path and the path of dying lead to the same place, that a person who has worked with the unconscious throughout their life, who has honestly changed, who faced his own shadow, who allowed the ego to lose control gradually and repeatedly, this man will not encounter death as something unknown. Meet her as something through which he has already gone, multiple times, on a small scale, in dreams and visions and moments when something inside him broke, and instead of catastrophe there was only peace. It was a moment that Jung privately described as the closing of the circle. For years he studied the psyche from the outside and from the inside, through dreams and myths and patience and his own experiences. And now in the midst of life, he stood before something that was not a theory, something that was not a hypothesis requiring verification, something that was an observation so repeatedly confirmed, so coherent in its structure, that he could utter it with a kind of calm that has nothing to do with self-confidence, but everything to do with humility before something that is simply greater. Death is not the end. It is a transition to a state that the psyche knows, to a state from which we come and to which we return. And this transition can be made to be consciously aware before biological death, if a person has the courage to go deep enough. But to fully understand this, to truly grasp it, and not just accept it intellectually, Jung had to confront a question that he had kept at a distance his whole life. A question about God. This is what the sacred is. This is what his father felt standing behind the pulpit, and to what he felt himself sitting by the bed of the dying patient. Do these two things have anything in common? And the answer he reached would surprise anyone who thought that Jung already understood. It was the year 1959, a few months before the death, when a journalist from the British television BBC directly asked Jung if he believes in God. Jung sat in silence for a moment, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew too well how every answer would be heard, how it would be reduced to something simpler than it actually is, how the words he would say would be taken out of context and used as evidence of something they are not evidence of. And then he said, "I don't believe it, I know. The world has divided into two halves. Some heard the confirmation of faith, others heard arrogance. Some thought that Jung was talking about the Christian God, about a personal God, about a God to whom one prays and who responds. Others thought he was talking about some mystical absolutism that has no connection to reality. Almost nobody asked what Jung really meant. And Jung meant something that he tried to say throughout his whole life, but what escaped into the space between the words every time? Something for which there is no good language, because every available language is too anchored in one of the two traditions that Jung wanted to transcend. The religious tradition that says God is outside, is a person, has a will and a plan, and one must humble oneself before him. Or the scientific tradition that says there is nothing beyond matter, consciousness is a product of the brain. The question about God is a poorly posed question. Jung did not belong to any of those traditions. It was both his curse and his freedom throughout his life. To understand what he said that evening on the BBC, one must go back to the beginning, to the boy who grew up in a pastoral home and very early felt that something was not right, that the God his father speaks of is described too precisely, too confidently, too purely to be real, that the true experience of the sacred, which Jung had, because he had it multiple times since childhood, cannot be contained in any sermon, in any catechism, in any formula. He was a few years old when on a warm summer day he sat in front of the church and looked at the blue sky. Suddenly, without any reason, without any preparation, he felt something that he could not describe in any other way than as absolute fullness. As if the world for a moment stopped being a collection of separate things and became one thing, pulsating, alive, present. It lasted maybe a few seconds, and then it passed, and he was again a boy sitting on a bench. But something remained, some trace, some belief that what he felt was more real than anything his father spoke about in church, and throughout his life he searched for a language in which he could describe it. Freud did not help him. Freud considered religious experiences as a regression, a return to childhood helplessness, an illusion created by a mind that cannot bear its own finitude. Jung understood where it came from. He understood the arguments, but he knew that Freud was talking about something different from what he himself had experienced. That Freudian analysis of religion is an analysis of religion as an institution, as a social system, as a projection. It is not an analysis of direct experience which does not ask for any institution and does not need any system. Jung began to look elsewhere. He started reading the Gnostics, alchemists, mystics. He began to study Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, not because he was looking for religion, but because he was looking for maps of a territory he knew from experience, but for which Western psychiatry and Western theology equally lacked an appropriate language, and in these old texts, written by people separated from him by centuries and millennia, he found what he was looking for. Not doctrines, not dogmas, but descriptions of experiences that sounded familiar, which described the same territory that Jung knew, only in different words, through different metaphors, with a different cultural baggage, but structurally the same. Gnostics spoke of the divinity hidden within man, of the divine spark concealed by layers of illusion. Christian mystics spoke of a part of the soul which is directly connected to God, which is, in a sense, God, although official theology considered such formulations to be heresy. The Hindu Upanishad said that Atman and Brahman are one, that the individual self and the cosmic self are the same thing seen from two sides. Buddhism said that what I, which a person protects and nurtures, is an illusion, and behind that illusion is something that cannot be named, but can be experienced. Jung read all of this and thought, they are talking about the same thing, in different words, through different cultures, but about the same thing. What I am talking about is what he observed in his patients. It is what he himself experienced as a boy in front of the church. It is what emerges from the human psyche every time the ego loses control long enough for something deeper to speak. And then Jung formulated what became his most important and boldest assertion. An assertion that is still misunderstood today because it sounds too simple to grasp how much lies behind it. He said that God is a psychic reality of the highest intensity. That what people have called God for thousands of years is not an external being, separate from man, sitting somewhere outside the cosmos and passing judgment. It is the deepest layer of the human psyche. It is what Jung called the self, the psychic center that is something more than the ego, which contains the ego, like the ocean contains the waves, which is what remains when the ego is silent. It was not atheism. Jung never said that God does not exist. He said something significantly harder to accept, as it requires much more responsibility from a person. He said that what you are looking for outside is inside, that the temple you are pilgrimaging to is you, that the prayer directed outward sometimes provides relief, directed inward opens access to something. What external prayer merely touches with a shadow. It sounds like spiritual egocentrism. It sounds like saying God is me. But Jung meant something exactly the opposite. The I he was speaking to is not the I in the colloquial sense. It is not the ego. It is not the personality. It is not what we think when we say I want or I feel. The self is something to which the ego is small, something in which the ego is immersed like a fish in the ocean, something that contains everything that the ego has rejected, pushed away, hidden, that contains the shadow. What contains potential that has never been realized. What contains, as Jung increasingly believed towards the end of his life, something that has no individual boundaries, something that connects a person to something greater than themselves. That is why he said he does not believe that he knows. Faith assumes distance. It assumes that the believer is here and the object of faith is there, that there is a chasm between them that faith tries to fill. Jung said that this abyss is an illusion, that between man and what he calls God, there is no abyss, there is only ignorance, ignorance of one's own depth. And when this unconsciousness is overcome by work, by going deep within, by meeting the self, then a person does not begin to believe, starts to know, because it experiences directly. That was the foundation, but Jung did not stop there. In his later years, when he wrote privately and no longer had to worry about how he would be received by the academy, he went further. He began to speak directly about what he had avoided saying too loudly throughout his entire professional life, about the fact that consciousness is not a product of the brain, that the brain is an instrument of consciousness, not its source, that just as a radio does not produce music, but receives and processes it, thus the brain does not produce consciousness, but gives it a form adapted to three-dimensional, temporal, material world. This statement has gigantic implications. If it is true, then brain death is not the death of consciousness. It is like a radio malfunction. Music does not disappear, it ceases to be audible through this specific receiver. Jung knew that he could not prove it. He knew that this assertion transcended the limits of what science could verify, and that is precisely why he never proclaimed it publicly as a scientific fact. But in private conversations, in letters, in notes that he wrote for himself, he spoke of it with increasing certainty. A certainty that was not certainty, certainly of evidence, but certainly of experience, certainly of a person who has observed the psyche in its most extreme states for decades, and who has seen something that no materialistic model can satisfactorily explain. He saw that dying patients have dreams that contain information they could not acquire through normal cognitive channels. I saw synchronicities, coincidences so precise and so charged with meaning that chance as an explanation became more strained than any alternative. He saw how different people in different parts of the world, without any contact with each other, reached the same deep images, the same archetypes, the same experiences. He finally stopped looking for an explanation that would fit within the framework of materialistic science. Not because he rejected science, but because science itself, honestly practiced, must admit that it does not explain everything, that there are observations that do not fit within its framework. Jung wrote something in his last months that his loved ones described as striking in its simplicity. He wrote that throughout his life he had feared one thing more than anything else: no death, no pain. He was afraid that something he felt as a boy in front of the church would turn out to be an illusion, that this moment of absolute fullness of that feeling, that everything is one, and that it is unimaginably beautiful, that it was just a chemical mistake in the developing brain of a child. And he wrote that after 50 years of work, observation, analysis, and his own experience, he is no longer afraid of it. Not because he found evidence, but because he found consistency, that every thread he had pulled throughout his life led to the same place, that the human psyche, studied honestly and without assumptions, without shortcuts and without fear, consistently points to something that is greater than itself, something that is both the most intimate and the most cosmic, to something why the word God may be imperfect, but other words are even worse. And in this sense, I said, I know. He did not know like a doctor who has the test results. He knew like a man who had walked his whole life to one place and finally got there. And standing in this place, looking back at the entire road, he understood that he had always been heading there. That every turn, every mistake, every moment of doubt, and every moment of certainty, all of this was part of the same movement. That which Jung said about God one cannot understand without understanding the whole rest, without understanding what he saw by the beds of dying patients, without understanding that the same process he discovered in living people, without understanding that the self he was talking about is not an abstract concept, but something that can be encountered, something that waits every time the ego falls silent long enough for something deeper to speak. And that is why its last message is not a religious message, is not a call to believe in a specific God, nor to abandon faith, is something more difficult and more important. It is an invitation to delve into oneself, to the meeting with that which has been avoided throughout life. To know oneself not in the sense of psychological self-development, but in the sense which Jung considered to be the only truly important task of human life. To know what one is when you stop being what you try to be, and only what has always been remains. There is a certain question that Jung would ask his patients at the beginning of his work, not as a therapeutic technique, not as a diagnostic method, but because he considered it one of the few questions that have the power to truly move something. The question was, who are you when no one is watching? Not who you want to be, not who you should be, not who you were raised to be, but who are you really? At this moment when there is no mirror, no audience, no person whose presence requires you to play any role. Most people, when they heard this question, fell silent, not because they didn't understand, but because she understood too well. But somewhere in the middle, beneath all the layers that had piled up over the years, there was something that had not been touched for a very long time. Something that waited patiently, like a room in a house that had stopped being entered because it was forgotten that it even exists. Jung spent his whole life helping people open those doors. At the end of his life, when he looked back at all the patients, at all the people who had passed through his office, at all the dreams they had described, at all the moments when something broke within them and instead of emptiness there was peace, saw one pattern that repeated without exception. Those who had the courage to delve deeply into this question, who did not stop at the first convenient answer, who went further than was comfortable. These people were changing in a way that was not easy to describe from the outside, but which was absolutely visible. They were becoming less fearful, not because the world was becoming safer, but because they stopped identifying solely with what could be lost. This is Jung's ultimate message. Not a theory, not a system, not another map that tells you where to go, but the invitation to one specific thing that requires more courage than anything else, because it takes place in absolute silence, without an audience, without a reward that anyone could see from the outside. Jung called this process individuation. The word sounds technical and academic, which is a separate irony, because what he was talking about is absolutely unacademic. Individuation does not mean becoming exceptional in the sense that culture understands, It does not mean standing out, achieving more, or building a better image. It means something exactly opposite. It means becoming what one truly is, instead of what one tries to be. It means returning to something that was before all the masks, before all the roles, before all the expectations. And this is paradoxically the most difficult thing that Jung ever taught. Not because it requires extraordinary abilities, but because it requires something that modern culture teaches us not to do. It requires stopping. It requires sitting with a question that has no quick answer. It requires enduring the discomfort of not knowing who we are, long enough for something deeper to start responding. Jung observed how this process unfolds naturally in the dying. He saw how the ego, deprived of the possibility of escape, eventually fell silent, and then something appeared that had been beneath him all the time, something warm, calm, whole. Something that did not come into existence at the moment when the ego quieted, but has always existed, only it was not audible due to the noise that the ego constantly produces. And his final message, a message he repeated in various forms throughout the last years of his life, was very simple. You don't have to wait for death to hear it. You can start listening now, but what does that mean in practice? Jung never left a list of steps, he didn't write a guide, and it wasn't an oversight. It was a conscious choice of a person who understood that every path inward is different because every person is different, and that any universal recipe immediately becomes another mask, another structure behind which the ego hides. Jung described the signs, the signals that the psyche sends when it is ready, when individuation knocks on the door, whether the person is ready for it or not. The first signal is the feeling that the life you have built no longer fits you. No, it's not that it's bad, it's not that you've made a mistake, but that it's kind of too tight, that the roles you play, the profession you are, the relationships you function in, are not bad. You react to the story you have been telling about yourself for years. Suddenly it starts to weigh in a way you haven't felt before. That when you wake up in the morning and think about what awaits you, instead of energy, there is a kind of fatigue that does not come from lack of sleep. Jung called it the call of the self. Not a whim, not a crisis that will pass after the holidays or a raise, but a signal that a part of you, deeper than the ego, has matured to something that the ego has not yet caught up with. That you are ready for a stage that you do not yet understand, but which is inevitable if you have the courage to respond to it. Another signal is the intensification of dreams. Not every dream is a message. Jung was a psychiatrist and knew that most dreams are information processing, organizing experiences, discharging voltage. But there is a certain kind of dream that is different, that has a quality distinct from all others, which, upon waking, leaves not only an image but a mood that lasts for hours, which returns repeatedly in different forms with the same essence. Jung considered such dreams to be a direct communication with the unconscious, as letters that the psyche writes to the conscious mind in the only language it can use when the conscious mind does not drown everything out with its incessant monologue. When such dreams intensify, when they begin to repeat themes, symbols, images, Jung said that they should not be analyzed in an intellectual way. It's not about determining what they mean in a literal sense. It's about sitting with them, about allowing their mood, their emotional temperature to slowly seep in and change something from the inside, what cannot be changed through reasoning. The third signal is what Jung called the calling by the shadow. The shadow is everything you have rejected in order to be accepted. Emotions that have been judged as inappropriate, needs that you considered a weakness, parts of yourself that family, school, and culture have trained you not to see, not because they were bad, but because they did not fit the image you were supposed to be. The shadow does not disappear when it is rejected. It descends beneath the surface, and from there it influences. It appears as an inadequate response to someone's comment, like jealousy that you are ashamed of, like a recurring pattern in relationships that ends the same way every time, and every time you tell yourself, it's not my fault, they have changed. The shadow is in what you judge others most harshly for. It is in what irritates you the most in others. There is in this what you cannot stand, when someone criticizes you, although part of you knows that they are right. Jung said that meeting with the shadow is a necessary condition for individuation, that one cannot reach the self without going through the shadow. Fear is a hole, and the hole contains everything, including what we do not want to see. And paradoxically, when a person stops fighting with their own self, and it begins to integrate, to accept as part of itself, not as a hostile takeover, but as a return of a lost part, something relaxes. Energy that for years has been used to maintain the shadow in confinement suddenly becomes available, and a person does not know where this energy comes from, where this lightness comes from, where the feeling comes from that they are more themselves than ever before. The fourth signal is longing, which cannot be defined. Jung described it as one of the most common yet least understood human experiences. A feeling that something is missing, but it is not known what. That somewhere there is something to which one belongs, but it is unknown where. That amidst life, which from the outside looks completely, there is some gap, some absence, that has no name. Culture has many answers to this. It says, buy something, go somewhere, fall in love, change jobs, lose weight, achieve more, and each of these answers fills the gap for a moment, but it draws attention to the surface. But the gap returns because it does not come from the surface, comes from the depths, and the only answer that truly responds to it is not any external change. It is directing attention to where the longing comes from, into the inside, down into the silence. Jung said that this longing is the most honest thing in a person, that it is the voice of the self, which calls through the veil of the ego, through the noise of everyday life, through layers of roles and masks. That if a person can sit with this longing without an attempt to immediately drown it out or satisfy it, if he can just be with her for a moment and ask what you really want to tell me, this is what Jung called the first step on the road to oneself. And here we arrive at this, what is perhaps the most difficult part of Jung's entire message. The most difficult, because it is directed not to someone else, but directly to you, to everyone who is listening, because Jung did not speak of it as a possibility. He spoke of it as a responsibility. He once said in a private conversation, which one of his students noted down, that an underdeveloped psyche is not only a personal tragedy. It is a burden that a person places on everyone around them, that a person who has not encountered their own shadow projects it onto others and makes them enemies that they themselves have created. That a person who lives solely on the surface of themselves brings fear and unawareness to every relationship, to every conversation, to every decision, which spread like waves. That working on oneself is not a luxury for those who have time. It is a duty towards everyone you are in contact with. This is a tough message. Self-development, in its popular form, says, work on yourself to be better, happier, more effective, more attractive to the life you want. Jung said something different. He said, work on yourself because you are part of something that is bigger than you, and your unconsciousness affects that something in a way that you do not see, but which is real. A few weeks before his death, Jung talked to his daughter. He did not talk about his achievements. He did not talk about the legacy. He talked about what still intrigues him, what still worries him, what still feels like an open question, and he told her something that she remembered word for word and repeated many years later in one of the interviews. He said, the only thing I regret, that so many people live and die, not knowing that there is something more than what they see. Not because it is something inaccessible, but because no one told them that it is worth searching. He did not regret his own mistakes. He did not regret breaking away from Freud. He did not regret the controversies that accompanied him throughout his life. He did not regret the years spent studying things that the Academy considered suspicious. He regretted those to whom his work did not reach, those who lived and died on the surface of themselves, not knowing that just beneath that surface something awaited, for which it was worth living. And this is the ultimate content of his last message. No call to any specific practice, not a prescription, not a promise that if you do this and that, you will be happy, but something much simpler and much more difficult at the same time. Permission. Permission to start searching, to take seriously what you have felt inside for a long time, but why you did not give it a voice. To treat your own dreams, your own intuitions, your own moments of absolute silence and absolute fullness, not as disturbances in normal functioning, but as signals. As letters that your psyche has been writing to you for years, waiting for you to finally open them. Jung was 85 years old when he died, on June 8, 1961, in his home in Küsnacht, at sunset by the lake. People who were with him said that the last hours were calm, that there was no fear in them, that there was a kind of concentration in him, as if he were a very attentive witness to something he was seeing for the first time, and at the same time had always known. Maybe it's just a story that loved ones tell about someone they loved. Maybe it contains more wishful thinking than observation. But maybe, and this is a hypothesis that Jung leaves to each person individually, maybe a person who has gone deep throughout their life without fleeing, who has encountered their own shadow without turning away, who ask the hardest questions without demanding easy answers. Maybe such a person really reaches the end differently. Not because death is easier for him, but because it is familiar to him. I have already gone through it many times, each time when the ego quieted and only what is remained. The question that Jung leaves is not a philosophical question. It is not a question that one needs to ponder for years before taking any action. It is a question that one can start answering today, now, at this moment, when you hear this. Who are you? When no one is watching, don't rush your answer, because the first answer will be the answer of the ego. It will be built from the words you already know, from the image you already have. Wait a little longer. Let the question remain, to make it do what good questions do. It peeled back the layers slowly, carefully, without haste. And if there is silence underneath that you did not expect, do not run away from it. Jung said that right there, in that silence, lies the answer you have been searching for your whole life, not knowing that you were searching for it. The self does not scream. It does not demand attention. It does not compete with the noise of the world. It waits, with a patience that knows no haste, for it has a time that transcends the time we know. The only question is, do you have time to listen to her?